Russia-Ukraine live updates, negotiations that could end the war in Ukraine. In the early hours of February 24, 2022, the Russian Air Force struck goals across Ukraine. At the same time, Moscow's infantry and armor poured into the Usava from the north, east, and south. Within the days that followed, the Russians attempted to encircle Kyiv. These were the primary days and weeks of an invasion that could nicely have resulted in Ukraine's defeat and subjugation via Russia. In retrospect, it seems almost awesome that it did now not. What occurred at the battlefield is noticeably nicely understood. What is less understood is the simultaneous in-depth international relations related to Moscow, Kyiv, and a number of different actors that could have resulted in a settlement simply weeks after the battle began. With the aid of the stop of March 2022, a series of in-man or woman meetings in Belarus and Turkey and digital engagements over video convention had produced the so-called Istanbul Communique, which described a framework for agreement. Ukrainian and Russian negotiators then started operating at the textual content of a treaty, making sizable development toward an agreement. However, the talks broke off. The battle raged on and has due to the fact that cost tens of thousands of lives on both sides. What took place? How near were the events to finishing the struggle? And why did they by no means finalize a deal? To shed mild on this often not noted however vital episode in the struggle, we have tested draft agreements exchanged among the two aspects, a few info of that have no longer been stated formally. We've also conducted interviews with several members within the talks in addition to with officials serving on the time in key Western governments to whom we've granted anonymity in order to speak about touchy topics. And we have reviewed several contemporaneous and more recent interviews with and statements by Ukrainian and Russian officers who have been serving on the time of the talks. Maximum of these are available on YouTube but aren't in English and thus not well known within the West. Eventually, we scrutinized the timeline of occasions from the begin of the invasion through the end of when talks broke down. Whilst we put most of these pieces together, what we found is unexpected, and will have great implications for future diplomatic efforts to stop the struggle. A few observers and officers, together with, most prominently, Russian President Vladimir Putin, have claimed that there was a deal at the desk that could have ended the battle, however that the Ukrainians walked away from it because of a combination of strain from their Western purchasers and Kyiv's personal hubristic assumptions about Russian Navy weak spot. Others have disregarded the importance of the talks absolutely, claiming that the events had been merely going through the motions and shopping for time for battlefield realignments or that the draft agreements had been unserious. Although the one's interpretations comprise kernels of fact, they difficult to understand more than they illuminate. There has been no single smoking gun, this tale defies simple explanations. Similarly, such monocausal accounts elide completely a truth that, in retrospect, seems excellent. Inside the midst of Moscow's remarkable aggression, the Russians and the Ukrainians nearly finalized an agreement that might have ended the conflict and provided Ukraine with multilateral protection ensures, paving the manner to its permanent neutrality and, down the road, its club within the EU. A very last agreement proved elusive, however, for a number of reasons. Kyiv's Western partners have been reluctant to be drawn right into a negotiation with Russia, especially one that would have created new commitments for them to make certain Ukraine's safety. The public temper in Ukraine hardened with the invention of Russian atrocities at Irpin and Bucha. And, with the failure of Russia's encirclement of Kyiv, President Volodymyr Zelensky have become more confident that, With sufficient Western assist, he should win the warfare at the battlefield. Sooner or later, although the events try to solve lengthy standing disputes over the safety structure, presented the possibility of a long-lasting decision to the conflict and enduring local balance, they aimed too excessive, too quickly. They tried to supply an overarching settlement even as a fundamental ceasefire proved out of reach. Today, whilst the prospects for negotiations appear dim and family members among the parties are almost non-existent, the records of the spring 2022 talks might look like a distraction with little perception without delay relevant to give circumstances. But Putin and Zelensky amazed every person with their mutual willingness to don't forget some distance accomplishing concessions, to quit the war. They may nicely surprise absolutely everyone once more inside the destiny. Guarantee or guarantee? What did the Russians want to accomplish by invading Ukraine? On February 24, 2022, Putin gave a speech in which he justified the invasion by way of mentioning the indistinct aim of denazification of the United States. The most reasonable interpretation of denazification became that Putin sought to topple the government in Kyiv, in all likelihood killing or taking pictures Zelensky inside the procedure. But days after the invasion started, Moscow started out probing to locate grounds for a compromise. A conflict Putin predicted to be a cakewalk became already proving something, however, and this early openness to speaking shows he seems to have already deserted the idea of outright regime trade. Zelensky, as he had earlier than the war, voiced an immediate interest in a non-public meeting with Putin. Though he refused to talk immediately with Zelensky, Putin did hire a negotiating team. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko played the part of mediator. The talks began on February 28 at considered one of Lukashenko's spacious nation-state residences near the village of Lyskaviki, about 30 miles from the Ukraine-Belarus border. The Ukrainian delegation became headed by David Arakhamia, the parliamentary chief of Zelensky's political party, and blanketed Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov, presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak, and different senior officers. The Russian delegation became led through Vladimir Medinsky, a senior advisor to the Russian president who had earlier served as way-of-life minister. It also blanketed deputy ministers of defense and foreign affairs, amongst others. At the first meeting, the Russians presented a fixed of harsh conditions, efficaciously annoying Ukraine's capitulation. This changed into a non-starter. But as Moscow's position at the battlefield persevered to deteriorate, its positions on the negotiating desk became much less demanding. So on March 3 and March 7, the events held a 2D and 0.33 spherical of talks, this time in Kamieniuki, Belarus, simply across the border from Poland. The Ukrainian delegation supplied needs in their very own, a direct ceasefire place and the established order of humanitarian corridors that would permit civilians to securely go away, the warfare sector. It changed into for the duration of the one-third round of talks that the Russians and the Ukrainians appear to have tested drafts, for the primary time. In line with Medinsky, these had been Russian drafts, which Medinsky's delegation delivered from Moscow and which likely reflected Moscow's insistence on Ukraine's impartial reputation.